You're watching Jim Cantelon Today Television. This is Bible study for the 21st century. So welcome, friends, to Jim Cantelon Today. I'm Jim Cantelon. Surprise, surprise. This is a program, if you're watching it for the first time, that has been going through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John. I include Acts because it's volume 2 of Luke. We've been doing it now for several years, and we take our time. And I'm always imagining that you're there with your Bible open and that we're studying the Scripture together, because this is, as I say, Bible study for the 21st century. Back right after this.
WOW! Working for Orphans and Widows is a trusted Christian charity reaching out to the sick and the dying, the least of these in pandemic-stricken Africa and India. For over 22 years, Jim and Kathy Cantelon have engaged with community-based champions and church volunteers in the care for those whom Jim calls society's weakest link. Everything from home-based palliative care to the rescue and protection of young women and girls who are victims of abuse is done in the name of Jesus and is overseen by local partner champions and an army of church-based volunteers. WOW has a proven track record. Check it out on wowmission.com, or if you wish, you can call or write to us. Its sustainability is dependent on the support of faithful friends like you.
So friends, we are in the Gospel of John chapter 6, starting today. And just fair warning, chapters 6, 7, and 8 are just packed full of content. And they're very long chapters too. And it's a bit of a challenge for me in the context of, two teaching segments in a half hour to kind of pace myself and get through them in such a way that I don't leave you totally hanging until the following week. But I'm making no promises, but I'll do my best. So let's start with John chapter 6, verse 1. And this is, there we go. This is John, of course, the beloved disciple, self-proclaimed beloved. He's reflecting on the life and ministry of Jesus. He's writing probably maybe a decade or so, maybe later than that, after having walked and talked and lived with Jesus for 3 years with the other disciples. And so he has a kind of an interesting way of looking at things, because in his view, it was all about the love of God. It was all about Jesus, the Son of God. All of the I am statements, I am the bread of life, I am the door, I am, I'm this, I'm that, kind of characteristic of John's recollections. And he has a kind of an intimate sort of perspective on the inner workings of the relationship between Jesus and his disciples, and the profound impact of his ministry as Son of God, Son of the Father, doing the will of the Father. He's really quite unique in terms of the Matthew, Mark, and Luke comparisons. Between the four of them, they really give you a very comprehensive picture of the life and ministry of Jesus. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels, meaning they sort of, Matthew and Luke kind of depend on Mark, which is probably the first gospel written, for a lot of their detail, even though they themselves, are very profound and excellent writers. John is not synoptic. He's sort of more heart to heart, if you will, in terms of his recollection of the life of Jesus. Okay, so Matthew 6. Sometime after this, and after this meaning, after what was being referred to in chapter 5, that began with Jesus healing a lame man at the pool of Bethesda, and this huge controversy emerged because he did it on the Sabbath. And so he gets into this long dissertation, this long interaction with his detractors, who were mainly Pharisees, and maybe a few Sadducees and temple officials as well. But it's after a fairly lengthy discussion, and he's going to pick it up again as we get on here. But that's what he's referring to when he says after this. After this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he'd performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. And when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough food for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus answered, said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place. They sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Now, I need to say off the top that John and the other gospel writers were not concerned about chronology. They did not sit down in a committee and say, "Now let's make sure we got, the same sequence of events here, so nobody can question the integrity of our account." That was the farthest thing from their mind. They were not writing by committee. They were not concerned that their account, jibe exactly with the other guy's account. They had no concern for chronology. So when John writes, sometime after this, he might have said, or he might have written, by and by, or a few days, a few weeks, a few months later, or even sometime later. That's all that means. And some Bible scholars think that maybe up to a year had passed since, from Passover to Passover. We don't know. And it's not important to John, so it's not important to us. But if he had been concerned about every detail of Jesus' life and ministry in proper order, the hyperbolic prospect of the last 2 sentences of his gospel would have come true. And in the last 2 sentences of his gospel, what does he say? He says this: "Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them are written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written." That's hyperbole. That's exaggeration for the sake of emphasis. But nevertheless, it makes a point. As is the case with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're not giving, a blow by blow, hour by hour, day by day, month by month account of the life and ministry of Jesus. They pick and they choose. They cherry pick. And what they choose, they feel is important. They feel it has life lessons. They feel it has teaching values. So that's the way it is. So in this case, when John says sometime after this, that'll suffice as merely a transition statement. Okay. Jesus and the 12, they sail across the lake to the eastern shore to find a little rest. And when I say that, I picture it because, as you know, if you watch JCT, for 7 years, my wife and I pastored in Jerusalem, Israel, at the invitation of the Israeli government to plant a church in Jerusalem, which we did. It's called King of Kings, Jerusalem. You can Google it. A tremendous experience, and the church is really doing well. But every week I would drive from Jerusalem down through the Judean wilderness, way below Jerusalem to Jericho, and then I would go along the Jordan Valley, along the Jordan River, all the way up to the Sea of Galilee, Tiberias on the western shore, through Tiberias, up the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, past the Capernaum, past the Mount of Beatitudes where Jesus did the Sermon on the Mount, into the Upper Galilee, all the way to the northern border of Israel and Lebanon, where I would then, with a military pass, be allowed to drive into Lebanon. And I used to do a weekly broadcast out of a radio station in a war zone, in a battlefield, right there below Beaufort Castle, where the PLO were raining down mortar shells and other kinds of nasty things, Katyusha rockets, etc. whenever they wanting to wipe us out and wipe anyone else who was out in that area. Fascinating story. Sometime maybe I should tell you about it. But nevertheless, when I read this, going to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, I mean, it's 3D for me. I picture it because I've been there so many times, and I've seen this scene so many times. So there they are on the eastern shore, the northeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd followed him, we read, not in boats, but by walking around the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee, by the way, is not a sea. It's a lake. It's not a big lake. It may be, over there, we talk in terms of kilometers, maybe 12 kilometers north to south, maybe 7 kilometers east to west. By North American standards, it's a puddle, you know, and yet it plays such a critical role in the life and history of Jesus and then life and history of Israel for centuries. So this great crowd follows him. They walk, and this would have been, you know, from Tiberias, from maybe 10 kilometers, from Capernaum, maybe 6 kilometers. It was a fair walk. Anyway, they walk around the northern shore, and they were not going to let Jesus out of their sight. Too many of them were in need of healing. Jesus was like a mobile medical clinic as far as many of them were concerned. They weren't really looking for doctrine. They weren't looking for the kingdom of heaven. They're just looking for healing. Humans are humans. But from one of the mountains on what are today called the Golan Heights, Jesus looks down and he sees this crowd converging on the beach below. And rather than try to escape, he decided to go down and meet with them and feed them. That's what we just read. Now, that northeastern shore is probably, it could be what's called the Plain of Bethesda. It's quite flat there, and there is a lot of grass there. And the grass is right there at the foot of the slopes that go up, you know, to the Golan Heights above the lake. The Golan Heights are basically all the way from northern Israel, from the Mount Hermon right down to the southern coast of the Sea of Galilee. But they're very prominent. I remember many times when I was in the area, especially at nighttime, if I happened to be there overnight, sitting on the shore of the Sea of Galilee on the west coast, looking to the Golan Heights, and they're way up there. There would be the lights of some kibbutzim up there, huge height, especially at night, but during the daytime too. They're not mountains exactly, but they're very high hills, the Golan Heights, as they're called. So this is the setting, and the feeding of the 5,000 is about to occur, and we'll get to that right after this break.
For over 20 years, WOW, working for Orphans and Widows, has been caring for vulnerable and at-risk women and children hard hit by the HIV and AIDS pandemic in Africa and India. WOW engages with local partner champions and church-based volunteers in the care of the desperately needy. Now, in recent months, we have expanded our reach to Ukraine. Over 8 million refugees have fled the ravages of that war-torn country, mostly women and children, including many orphans. Our partner in East Europe tells us of the busing of Ukrainian orphans through the night to safety. Churches have become refugee centers, opening their buildings to become safe havens in the rescue. And WOW has come alongside. We have begun supporting this rescue work, but there is so much more that we must provide to these heroic churches. They need funding to continue for hundreds of orphans yet to come. We may be only small players, but you can partner with us in the rescue of Ukrainian orphans. WOW is a proven ministry. We are grateful for your support. Call, write, or log on to wowmission.com and be inspired.
Now, just before we get to the feeding of the 5,000, you see during the breaks that we promote WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows. This is a ministry my wife and I started 23 years ago. We've been working in sub-Saharan Africa with, as it turns out now, after over 2 decades, tens of thousands of orphans and widows, most of whom are dying, initially from HIV and AIDS, then from COVID-19, a combination of the two. And the situation is still very, very delicate and very vulnerable. There are thousands of orphans and widows that are in great distress in some of the rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa. And so we work in South Africa, we work in Zambia, we also work in Malawi. Malawi, I think, is the 4th poorest country in the world. Malawi is really facing some tremendous crises. Now, as I'm speaking to you, as I'm recording this program, Cyclone Freddy is just now beginning to hit the southeast coast of Africa, flattening Madagascar and then into Mozambique and beyond Mozambique to Malawi, where we work, and also Zambia, where we work. And I got a video just yesterday from our champion ministry in Malawi, and there we go. There's a road that's partially washed out. Some of them are daring to run across it, which I think was pretty scary. But our team were there trying to get to the other side. They stopped, and one of them had a camera and took this picture. And look, there you go. Look at that. Just like that. And that's just one of the gravel roads that I've often traveled myself when I'm there with our champion ministry in Malawi. That just is a little reminder, of the vulnerability of people in general. I mean, we know about the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, the huge storms battering Brazil, the tremendous snowstorms that have been, it seems, week after week after week, lambasting the United States of America and southern Canada, southeast Canada. Weather phenomena seem to be just growing almost by the day. But, we can sort of handle it. The Turks and the Syrians and the Malawians, can't handle these things as well as we do because they're just not as wealthy as we are. They don't have the infrastructure we have. They don't have the first responders that we have. And so, a weather crisis like this only makes things worse for our very vulnerable people. The ones that we work with in most cases are living in mud huts or unfired brick buildings that basically melt in rain. And so I'm getting daily updates from Malawi as to the conditions there. And that little video of the road is just a case in point. The road yields to the weather. Very soon their homes are going to be yielding to the weather. And we're doing our very best to continue to help them with WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows. And when you support WOW, that's what you're working with. And you're working with us because WOW, JCT and WOW are one and the same. JCT is WOW and WOW is JCT. JCT is the voice of WOW, the voice of the orphan and the widow. And in that context, we present the gospel, which to me is the righteousness side of the equation. And then we work on the ground with the most vulnerable, the least of these, which to me is the justice side of the equation. Righteousness, fulfillment of relationship with God. Justice, fulfillment of relationship with neighbor. So that's what we're all about. Okay, where are we? Oh, yes, here we are. So Jesus says, where are we going to buy bread for these people to eat? And I read it. So there's this scholarly conjecture out there as to why Jesus asked Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Jesus knew full well what he's going to do. So when John writes, he asked this only to test him, it suggests that Jesus saw some need to develop Philip's faith. You remember in the upper room later, this was the same Philip that Jesus rebuked. Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you such a long time, how can you say, show us the Father? You remember that from John 14. We'll get to that eventually. It was the same Philip, however, who became a powerful evangelist to Samaria and indirectly to Ethiopia. his 4 daughters all became very full-time in prophetic ministry. And so like all the disciples, Philip was a work in progress. So John doesn't say how it happened, but somehow a small boy's humble lunch becomes available. Now, 2 things occur to me. Was the question a bit ironic, drawing attention to this feeble fare? 5 bread rolls and 2 sardines. That's what you get out of the Sea of Galilee, by the way. You get 2 kinds of fish. You get what's called St. Peter's fish, which is, maybe the size of a small bass, and then you get sardines. And the main fishing industry to this day out of the Sea of Galilee is thousands of tons of sardines. I don't know where they all come from. I mean, that lake's so small. It just keeps producing sardines like you wouldn't believe it. And I've seen the little fishing boats out there and the nets just teeming with sardines. That would probably be what this little guy had in his lunch. A thoughtful mother had packed it for him. Regardless, 5,000 men and probably as many women and children, pardon me, 10,000 in all. You don't feed them with that kind of content. So, nevertheless, they're all fed with stuff left over. And the people in wonder proclaim, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Now, well, let me read that, okay? He has the people sit down, plenty of grass, blesses the loaves, distributes them, and you have 12 loaves left over. Okay. So, verse 14, after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Now, you might not know this, but this was a very core expectation that was centuries old. An expectation that someone would come who would essentially take the place of and be in like personage to Moses. And what it is, it's a reference to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15. In fact, let me just turn to it. Deuteronomy 18:15, and I've memorized it, but let me read it to you. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. A prophet like me. And the people, they were not theologians. They saw Moses as prophetic, and they saw Moses prophesying, if you will, that another like him was going to come. And so for centuries, all the way from Moses to the time of Jesus, this hope had been alive. And so the people are saying, maybe this is the guy. Referring to this prophetic word from Moses. So while they marveled, Jesus withdrew up into the Golan Plateau. And again, John doesn't give us the details. Jesus was human as well as divine. He got tired. Sometimes he needed to get away from people. I mean, we can all relate to that, right? And he must have had word with the disciples. You guys just go ahead and I'll find my way home to Capernaum on my own. And there was no concern in those days about walking in the dark. And, plus, Jesus is the boss. So if that's what he says, okay, well, away we go. And Jesus often goes up into the mountains to pray. So there you go. That's the way he is. He likes to be alone. So that's what happens. But part of it was that he suspected that this crowd who were so in awe of what he'd just done in this miraculous feeding event wanted to crown him king and force him into some kind of acquiescence to this royal role. And of course, Jesus' time was not yet. Plus, he was never going to accede to that kind of popular and political pressure. So this is the scene. Jesus and his disciples go to the Golan Heights. The people follow them around the lake. He looks from the heights down, sees this crowd gathering on the shore. He comes down to meet with them. He tells them to sit on the grass there, which is part of the Bethesda plain. They sit there very obediently, 5,000 men, and probably just as many women and children. A lot of them have walked a long way. There's no problem with water because the Sea of Galilee is right there, and you can drink the water right out of the lake. But food, no food, except for this little boy's lunch. And so Jesus blesses this little lunch, multiplies it, feeds altogether, maybe 10,000 people, even though it's called the feeding of the 5,000, referring just to the men. Jesus basically says to the disciples, okay, you've collected up what's left over, just put it on the boat, away you go. I know it's getting dusk, but I'll come around and meet you on the other side later. I'm just going up by myself to pray. That's basically the scene that we've got. And it is a kind of a very human scene. But what is about to happen is anything but a human event. We'll get to that in a moment.
WOW! Working for Orphans and Widows has been caring for orphans and widows in Africa and India for over 20 years. Key to its vision is partnership with local champions who engage hundreds of church-based volunteers in home-based care. Care for the sick and the dying in their own humble homes. They are defenseless and afflicted. They are the least of these that Jesus would have us love and care for. Our partnered champions are based in South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, and India. They provide faithful, accountable, and godly care for thousands. Together with WOW, they truly are the hands and feet of Jesus to the sick and the dying. Founder and President Jim Cantelon has been committed to both teaching the gospel via Jim Cantelon Today TV and practicing the gospel through WOW. WOW is a proven ministry. We are grateful for your support. Call, write, or log on to wowmission.com and be inspired.
So we read in verse 18, a strong wind was blowing, the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. They were frightened. He said to them in his eye, don't be afraid. Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. The famous walking on the water scene. You know, it's received massive publicity over the years. The very idea that Jesus, or anyone for that matter, could walk on water was, beyond reason. There's no need to argue with this. John simply tells a story and moves on 6 sentences later. If Jesus was who he said he was, then he can and he could do what he did with impunity. And so while he rested and reflected on the Golan Heights, while his disciples battled a storm in the lake, Jesus walks down the mountain, continues across the water, shortcut to Capernaum, comforts the panicked 12, gets in the boat, the sea's calm, they sail to shore. End of story. There you go. Next time, we're going to get into what I call a hard teaching. Thanks for watching. See you next time.